The Gilded Cage. The restaurant was more than a dining hall. To the outside world, it was a palace of cuisine, a jewel of Manhattan's upper crust, where velvet curtains absorbed even the faintest whispers and chandeliers rained down light like frozen waterfalls. But to those who worked within its walls, it was something else entirely, both a stage and a prison. Amara Lewis had come to understand this truth better than most. For nearly 3 years, she had walked these corridors, her steps silent but sure, carrying trays that weighed almost as much as the dreams she had put on hold. She moved like water, flowing where needed, always careful to stay unnoticed unless her presence was required. Invisibility, she learned, was not a curse here, but a kind of armor. She was 26, the daughter of 2 worlds. Her mother, Naomi, had spent her life serving others as a nurse in a Harlem hospital, while her father, Dr. Klaus Heinrich, had been a German professor whose quiet lectures on literature and philosophy filled Amara's childhood with poetry, history, and the rhythm of another language. When she was still a girl, her father would sit her on his lap and read aloud the verses of Goethe and Rilke, the syllables rolling like music. It was through him she gained not just fluency, but a deep intimacy with German, not as a tool, but as a lens through which she saw the world. That gift, hidden now under the crisp black uniform of a waitress, was one of her greatest secrets, one she shared with no one at the restaurant. The Gilded Sanctuary, as patrons liked to call it, was not a place for secrets. It was a temple to wealth and exclusivity, where a single evening's bill could equal a month of rent for ordinary people. The menu was curated like scripture, each dish plated as if by a sculptor's hand, each wine older than the waiters who served it. Amara had memorized every table, every preference of the regular guests, and even the subtle signals by which they communicated their whims. The scrape of a knife meant a plate should be cleared. The delicate push of a chair meant a coat would soon be required. It was choreography disguised as hospitality, and Amara was among its finest dancers. Yet beneath the polished surface of precision and grace, she felt the weight of eyes. Sometimes those eyes lingered too long on the deep brown of her skin. Sometimes they flicked away too quickly, as if her presence was an inconvenience in their vision of wealth. There were jokes she had endured, the ones framed as compliments but rooted in prejudice. "Where did you learn such perfect English?" one man had asked, with genuine surprise that revealed far more about him than it did about her. Another had once called her sweetheart, in a tone that left a film of disdain. Each time she had smiled with the practiced grace of someone who knew her dignity mattered more than the ignorance of others. On this night, however, something felt different. The atmosphere carried a tension that even the chandeliers could not soften. The restaurant was full, every table occupied by executives, diplomats, and heirs to fortunes so vast they seemed detached from reality. Amara adjusted the white cuffs of her sleeves, steadied her breath, and reminded herself of her mother's words. "You are more than the uniform. The uniform is not your skin, and their money is not your worth." The evening's hum shifted when he arrived. Alexander Roth, a billionaire whose empire stretched across finance, technology, and media, entered with the slow confidence of a man who believed the world bent for his presence. He was tall, his tailored suit draped across broad shoulders, his watch glimmering faintly under the chandeliers. Around him trailed a small entourage, 2 younger executives eager to be seen in his shadow, and a woman with diamond earrings that caught the light with each turn of her head. Conversation softened as Roth moved across the floor, not out of respect, but recognition of power. Amara noticed how even the maitre d', a man whose pride was legendary, bowed slightly deeper than usual. She had heard of Roth before. Everyone had. His fortune was estimated in the tens of billions. His reputation for arrogance was almost as vast. He had been the subject of gossip in every publication, from Forbes to late-night talk shows, often portrayed as brilliant but ruthless. To Amara, he was just another man at another table. But to the staff, his presence meant something else entirely: the potential for disaster. One mistake before him could mean more than just a scolding. It could mean the loss of a job, perhaps even the unraveling of a career. When she approached his table, she did so with the same calm precision she always carried. Her tray held a bottle of Bordeaux, its vintage older than most of the staff working there. She placed it gently on the table, uncorked it with the elegance of ritual, and poured just enough into his glass for him to sample. Roth barely glanced at her as he swirled the wine, sniffed, and then smirked faintly. His companions leaned closer, eager to share in his inevitable wit. It was then that Roth turned his eyes to Amara and spoke in German. The words, sharp and cutting, carried both mockery and dismissal. He referred to her, not just as a servant, but as something less, his tone laced with derision. His companions laughed softly, assuming she could not understand, assuming she was as invisible as the glass in his hand. Amara froze for a heartbeat. She felt the weight of her father's voice in her memory, the endless nights he had spoken German to her until the cadence of it became her second heartbeat. She felt her mother's quiet resilience, the dignity she carried through long hospital shifts when no one thanked her, and she felt the years of enduring subtle insults, each one swallowed to keep her job. But something about Roth's sneer pierced through the armor she had built. Perhaps it was the way he leaned back in his chair, assured of his superiority. Perhaps it was the laughter of his companions, so eager to affirm cruelty. Or perhaps it was simply time. She set the bottle down, straightened her back, and lifted her gaze to meet his. The restaurant around her seemed to still, though no one yet knew why. And then, in flawless German, clear, precise, with the weight of literature and history in her tone, Amara replied. Her words cut through the room like a blade of truth. They were not cruel, not vulgar, not even angry. Instead, they were measured, elegant, and rooted in dignity. She turned his insult back upon him with the skill of a philosopher, reminding him that power without respect was nothing more than vanity. For a moment his smirk faltered. The wine glass in his hand trembled slightly, though he tried to disguise it with a sip. His companions stared at her, their laughter dying in their throats. The silence that followed was louder than applause. For the first time that evening, Alexander Roth looked directly at her, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a person he could not ignore. The reply that stopped the room. For a heartbeat, the restaurant seemed to stop breathing. The hum of clinking silverware, the soft shuffling of servers' shoes, the whispered laughter of millionaires. It all froze in the wake of Amara's voice. Her German was not just correct, it was alive. The cadence was sharp yet graceful, the accent clean as if she had been born within the very borders of Heidelberg itself. What startled the room was not merely the fact that she had understood the insult. It was the way she carried herself when she spoke, as though she were not answering as a waitress bound to serve, but as someone who stood equal to the man across the table. Her tone was steady, her posture tall, and her eyes unwavering. Alexander Roth, a man who had bent senators with donations and crushed competitors with a single phone call, sat frozen. His smirk, that perpetual expression of superiority carved into his face, faltered under the weight of her words. He had expected invisibility, expected compliance, expected that she would not even recognize what he had said. Instead, she had met him with a mirror so clean and so cutting that even his billions could not shield him. His hand hovered over his wine glass, and for the briefest second a tremor ran through his fingers. It was not fear of her, but fear of exposure, fear that his armor of untouchable arrogance had cracked before witnesses. The companions at his table shifted uncomfortably. One of the younger executives, who only moments before had chuckled at Roth's remark, lowered his eyes to the tablecloth, pretending sudden fascination with the folds of linen. The woman with the diamond earrings blinked, her laughter stuck in her throat, replaced with a silence that carried embarrassment. And though the restaurant was filled with people immersed in their own conversations, more than a few sets of eyes had turned toward Roth's table. Silence, after all, is louder than any outburst, and the absence of laughter was its own kind of spotlight. Amara did not linger after her reply. She did not wait for acknowledgement. did not search the room for approval. She simply adjusted the wine bottle, poured a perfect measure into the billionaire's glass, and stepped back with the same precision she had always carried. But within her chest, something shifted. It was not rebellion, not defiance, but release. For years she had endured the subtle degradations that came with her position, smiling through moments that scraped against her pride. And in a single moment, with a sentence spoken in her father's tongue, she felt the weight of silence lift. Roth tried to recover, of course. Men like him always did. He forced a chuckle, pretending as though he had meant his words as a test, a joke, a game. "Impressive," he muttered in English, his tone designed for the room rather than for her. "You speak it well." But the words rang hollow because everyone at the table knew what he had meant before. His companions, desperate to smooth the evening, raised their glasses in a feeble attempt to move forward, yet the air around them had changed. No matter how fine the Bordeaux, it could not wash away the bitterness of being exposed. For Amara, the moment was less about triumph and more about memory. As she moved back toward the service station, her mind drifted to her father. She could see him clearly, sitting at the kitchen table of their small apartment, stacks of books surrounding him like fortresses. He would recite lines of Goethe or Schiller, then pause and ask her to repeat them, to feel the rhythm in her mouth, to learn not only the words but the weight they carried. "Language is power," he had told her once, tapping the table with his pen. Power not to dominate, but to reveal truth. Those lessons had lived quietly within her for years, hidden behind trays and uniforms, and tonight, at last, they had stepped into the open. But not all memories were tender. Alongside her father's voice came the weight of the day she had lost him. 3 years earlier, a sudden illness had taken him before she could finish her doctoral work in Germany. She had returned to New York not with a degree, but with grief, her studies abandoned, her future uncertain. That was how she had ended up here, in the gilded sanctuary, carrying plates instead of books, translating silence into service rather than translating texts. She had thought the intellectual part of her life had been buried with him. And yet, standing there with Roth's astonished face still lingering in her mind, she realized it was not buried at all. It had only been waiting. The rest of the evening unfolded in strange quiet. Roth remained stiff, less talkative than usual, his arrogance dimmed by the awareness that the room now saw him differently. His power came from command, from certainty, from the performance of superiority. But a performance cracked is harder to repair than a broken glass. He paid his bill in silence, leaving a tip so exact it was insulting, and left with his entourage trailing behind him. The whispers began immediately after, not loud, not obvious, but like ripples in a pond, moving outward from the center. "Did you hear her?" She spoke better German than him. She answered him like a professor. The staff exchanged quick glances, but said nothing aloud. They had long learned that silence was safer than commentary. Yet even among them there was a quiet respect in the way they looked at Amara now. She had done what few dared. She had spoken back, and not in anger, but in mastery. Alone in the locker room after her shift, Amara sat on the wooden bench and let her breath finally escape in a long, shuddering exhale. The room smelled faintly of starch and detergent, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She opened her low curtain and stared at the worn copy of her father's book that always sat on the shelf, a collection of poems he had gifted her when she was 16. Its pages were creased, its cover faded, but within it lived the voice that had guided her through childhood. She traced her fingers along the words on the first page, written in his careful hand. "Sprich, dass ich dich sehe." Speak, so that I may see you. That night, she walked home through the cool streets of Manhattan, with her head held higher than usual. She was still a waitress, still invisible to most of the world. But in that moment, she felt her father walking beside her, proud of the daughter who had spoken. The ripples of truth. The next evening at the gilded sanctuary began the same as all others. The chandeliers glowed like captive constellations, the velvet curtains muffled the hum of conversations, and the scent of truffle and seared lamb drifted through the air like perfume. Yet beneath the surface of ritual, something had shifted. It began in whispers, in the quick flick of eyes toward Amara as she moved gracefully between tables. Word of the previous night had spread faster than the clinking of crystal. The staff who had witnessed it had kept their silence, but silence was never truly silent. It had a way of carrying itself, of finding ears that were ready to listen. By morning, the kitchen had buzzed with quiet speculation. By noon, the maître d' had raised an eyebrow as if he, too, had heard fragments. And by nightfall, even the guests, those accustomed to seeing the staff as faceless shadows, began to look at her differently. One patron, a retired diplomat with a habit of quoting obscure proverbs, stopped her mid-step as she refilled his glass. He leaned toward her and said in a low voice, "I heard you silenced Alexander Roth with his own language." His eyes sparkled with a kind of admiration, though he spoke as though sharing a dangerous secret. She smiled politely, said nothing, and continued her work. But inside she felt the warmth of his words. For years she had been invisible. Now her invisibility had cracked. But cracks are never without danger. Attention is a double-edged sword, and in the sanctuary it could be deadly. While some guests began treating her with new courtesy, others seemed unsettled, even resentful, as though she had broken a rule they themselves could not name. One woman, a banker's wife draped in emerald silk, muttered just loud enough for Amara to hear. She should know her place. The words stung, not because they were new. She had heard worse, but because they came now in response to her truth, as if dignity itself was an offense. Among the staff, reactions were mixed. A few of the younger waiters began to look at her with something like awe, their eyes wide as if she were a character from a story rather than a colleague. The older ones, hardened by years of survival in this gilded cage, gave her subtle warnings, a shake of the head, a whispered, "Be careful." They knew what she perhaps did not want to admit, that men like Roth did not forget humiliation. He might leave the restaurant, but he would not leave the wound behind. And indeed, Alexander Roth had not. In his penthouse high above the city, he replayed the moment in his mind, like a sour note he could not erase. The waitress's words haunted him, not for their content, but for what they represented. He had built his empire on the foundation of command, on the assurance that no one beneath him could challenge him. And yet, in front of his companions, before the silent audience of wealth, she had shattered that illusion. The more he thought of it, the more it consumed him. To him, it was not a moment of banter, but an injury to his pride, and pride was the currency he valued most. In the days that followed, Roth returned to the sanctuary more than once. Each time, Amara served him with the same calm precision as always, her face a mask of neutrality. Each time he sought an opportunity to reclaim his dominance. His insults grew more subtle, more calculated, as though he were testing the edges of her patience. He would comment on her posture, her tone, even the way she poured wine. He spoke in German again, this time cloaked in riddles, as if daring her to reveal herself once more. And each time she answered, not with anger, but with wit so measured it disarmed him further. The staff began to notice. At first it was amusement, then respect. Amara was no longer simply a colleague gliding through the routine of service. She was a quiet symbol of resistance. Her words, always chosen with care, became small acts of defiance against a man whose wealth had insulated him from truth. And though she never raised her voice, never broke the rules of the sanctuary, she carved out a presence that could not be ignored. Yet beneath her composure, Amara felt the weight of it all pressing down. After each exchange, she would retreat to the stillness of her apartment, where the walls seemed too thin to hold her thoughts. She would sit by the window overlooking the city and open her father's book, letting the German verses steady her heart. "Speak so that I may see you." The words repeated themselves like a mantra. She wondered if she was truly speaking for herself now, or if she was simply echoing the voice of a father who had believed in her more than she had ever believed in herself. One evening, after Roth had left the restaurant with his entourage trailing behind him, the chef approached her quietly in the locker room. He was a stern man, his face carved by years of discipline, but his eyes softened as he spoke. "Be cautious, Amara," he said in a low voice. "Men like him do not like to be reminded of their shadows." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to, but she carried his words with her like a warning bell. The ripple was spreading too far now. Roth's pride had been pierced, and Amara's dignity had stepped into light. The question was not whether the tension would break, but when and how. The test of fire. The night of the banquet arrived like a storm disguised in silk. From the moment Amara stepped into the gilded sanctuary, she sensed the difference. The air was heavier, the anticipation palpable, as though the chandeliers themselves strained under the weight of what was about to unfold. The maitre d' had told her that Alexander Roth had reserved the entire center hall for an exclusive dinner. Politicians, financiers, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries would be in attendance, each name carrying its own influence, each guest accustomed to power being bent in their favor. To the outside world, it was simply another lavish evening in the city's most untouchable restaurant. But to Amara, it was clear this was something else, a stage being set, and she was being positioned at its center. She had not asked to be part of the performance, yet Roth's presence in recent weeks, his calculated jabs and pointed remarks, had made one truth undeniable. He had not forgiven her. He had not forgotten that moment when her words had turned his laughter to silence. Pride, for men like him, was not a garment easily mended. Tonight he meant to reclaim it. The tables had been arranged in a horseshoe formation, the kind used in royal courts, with roses at the head like a monarch presiding over his domain. The crystal glasses glittered under the golden light, the silverware gleamed as though it had been polished with obsession, and the air was alive with the mingling perfumes of wealth. Amara carried herself with her usual grace, her face calm, her movements precise, but her pulse raced beneath her uniform. She knew he was watching her, even as he laughed with the mayor at his left and shook hands with a foreign investor at his right. His eyes tracked her across the room, like a predator circling prey. The first part of the evening passed in ritual, champagne poured, hors d'oeuvres served, the symphony of service performed with flawless timing. Amara moved silently, carrying trays that seemed to weigh little though they bent the arms of others. Each time she passed Roth's table, she felt his gaze like a stone pressed against her back. The staff whispered their unease in corners, but none dared speak it aloud. This was Roth's evening, and what Roth wanted, Roth would have. At last the moment arrived. Roth raised his glass, silencing the room with a gesture practiced over years of commanding attention. His voice, deep and self-assured, carried easily through the hall. He began with compliments to the chef, praises for the restaurant, and acknowledgments of his distinguished guests. The crowd responded with polite laughter, the kind given not because something is funny, but because the speaker holds power. Then, with a deliberate pause, Roth shifted his gaze toward Amara, who stood near the edge of the gathering with a tray in hand. "And of course," he said, switching into German, "we cannot forget the unique talents of the staff here, especially our multilingual waitress." His tone was honeyed with mockery, the words meant to sting. His companions chuckled obligingly, their eyes flicking to Amara with curiosity. Oath leaned back in his chair, confident, certain he had turned the knife. Amara felt the room tilt. Every gaze seemed to land on her, the weight of expectation pressing down like a tidal wave. She could have bowed her head, pretended not to hear, slipped back into invisibility. That would have been the safer choice. But something within her stirred, something deeper than pride, deeper even than defiance. It was the voice of her father, alive in her memory, reminding her that language was more than words. It was power, it was truth, it was the soul given shape. She set the tray aside, stepped forward, and in flawless German she answered, not with insult, not with bitterness, but with poetry. She recited lines from Heinrich Heine, weaving the verse with her own reflection, turning Roth's mockery into a meditation on dignity. Her voice was steady, her posture unshaken, and her eyes held his with quiet force. She spoke of how true power was not measured by wealth or influence, but by the ability to see humanity in others. She spoke of respect, of the weight of words, of the way laughter at another's expense reveals more weakness than strength. The room hushed. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses paused midway to lips. Her German rang through the hall like music, lyrical and precise, its beauty undeniable even to those who did not understand every word. Those who did, diplomats, investors, foreign guests, nodded slowly, their expressions shifting from amusement to admiration. Roth's face tightened. He forced a smile, but it was brittle, strained, a mask slipping under the heat of her truth. He had intended to make her small, to parade her as a curiosity before his peers. Instead, she stood before him as an equal, commanding attention without wealth, without power, without invitation, only with the force of her presence and the depth of her words. Then it happened, the sound of clapping. It began quietly from the end of the table where the retired diplomat sat, the same man who had whispered admiration to her days earlier. His hands came together slowly, deliberately, the sound carrying in the silence. Then another guest joined, then another, until the hall filled with applause. It was not raucous, not thunderous, but steady, respectful, undeniable. A recognition of truth spoken plainly in a place built on performance. Amara bowed her head slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement, and then returned to her duties as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The applause faded, replaced by murmurs, by eyes that saw her differently now, not as a shadow, not as a servant, but as a presence they could not dismiss. Roth sat rigid, his glass untouched, his pride wounded beyond repair. He forced himself to laugh, to redirect the room with anecdotes and boasts, but the performance rang hollow. No matter what he said, the image lingered, a billionaire mocked, and a waitress answering with poetry that made the room applaud. For Amara, it was not victory in the sense of conquest. It was not about humiliating him or elevating herself. It was simply truth given voice, dignity refusing to be silenced. Yet in that truth lay a power greater than she had imagined, a power that no amount of money could purchase, no empire could command. When the banquet ended and the guests departed into the night, the whispers followed them. By morning, the story would move beyond the sanctuary, carried in fragments across the city, the waitress who spoke with the voice of a scholar, the billionaire who could not answer. And though Amara left the restaurant as she always did, walking home through the quiet streets with her father's book pressed against her side, she knew something irreversible had taken place. The test had come, the fire had burned, and she had walked through it without being consumed. The legacy of a voice. The days that followed the banquet were unlike any Amara had ever known in her years at the Gilded Sanctuary. From the moment the applause had echoed in that glittering hall, something irreversible had shifted, not just in her own life, but in the unseen currents of the city's elite. Word traveled fast in such circles, faster in fact than Roth's attempts to smother it. Stories spread not in newspapers, though a gossip column or two hinted at an embarrassing incident at a high society dinner, but in private conversations, whispered in boardrooms, murmured over wine glasses, recounted in the lobbies of five-star hotels. "Have you heard of the waitress who silenced Roth?" became a question that carried with it both amusement and admiration, a story repeated with relish by those who had grown weary of Roth's arrogance but never dared confront it themselves. For Roth, the humiliation festered like an open wound. He stopped appearing at the sanctuary, though his absence was explained away by his assistants as urgent travel and important business abroad. But everyone knew. Even the maitre d', who normally worshipped men like Roth, walked the dining floor with a lighter step, as if relieved to be rid of the suffocating shadow of his presence. Roth's empire continued to churn, his money continued to grow, but a dent had been made in his armor, and in the rarefied world of billionaires and power brokers, even a dent could tarnish a reputation. Amara, however, did not seek to dwell on him. She returned each night to her duties, carrying trays and filling glasses, but she was no longer invisible. Guests greeted her by name, some with respect that had not been there before. A foreign ambassador requested that she be the one to explain the wine list, speaking to her in German with a smile of recognition. A publisher left his card discreetly on the edge of his plate, hinting that her knowledge and eloquence might be better served outside the walls of the restaurant. Even among the staff, a subtle reverence followed her. The young waiters whispered her story like legend, and even the older ones, hardened by years of silent endurance, looked at her with something close to pride. But with attention came unease. Amara was not naive. She knew that the world beyond the sanctuary did not always reward those who spoke with truth. For every door that cracked open, there were hands eager to close it. And yet she found herself walking home at night with her shoulders straighter, her steps surer, her father's book held against her chest like a shield. She would sit by the window of her modest apartment, open the creased pages, and read aloud in German until her own voice became a comfort. The words that once connected her to him now carried her forward, a reminder that she was more than her uniform, more than her silence. It was on one of these evenings, weeks after the banquet, that she received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was elegant, the envelope heavy, embossed with the crest of an academic institution in Berlin. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words once, then twice, before she allowed herself to believe. It was an invitation, a fellowship program, an opportunity to return to her abandoned doctoral studies, a chance to step back into the world she had thought lost forever. Someone, it seemed, had spoken on her behalf. Perhaps it was the diplomat or the publisher, or one of the anonymous guests who had seen not just a waitress, but a woman of intellect and courage. Whoever it was, they had opened a door she thought had been locked forever. Amara wept quietly in her apartment that night, tears of gratitude mixed with fear. The decision was not simple. Her life here was steady, safe in its predictability. To leave meant risk, meant stepping once again into a world that had already wounded her with loss. But she remembered the applause, the warmth of voices that had seen her truth, and she remembered her father's words etched into the pages of the book. Sprich, dass ich dich sehe. Speak, so that I may see you. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to be seen fully, not just in fleeting moments of defiance, but in the entirety of her being. And so, weeks later, when she hung up her uniform for the last time, the locker room felt different. The wooden bench, the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of starch. They no longer belonged to her. She placed her father's book gently into her bag, tied her hair back one final time, and walked out into the cool New York evening. The city roared around her, indifferent to her choices, yet she felt a calm certainty she had not known before. She was no longer a shadow in a gilded cage. She was a voice, a presence, a woman carrying the legacy of truth. As for Roth, he remained a ghostly absence in the sanctuary's halls. His power endured, but the story of that night followed him like an echo, a reminder that wealth could command attention but not respect, that arrogance could silence many but not all. And perhaps, though he would never admit it, he too had been changed by her words, not in humility, but in the quiet knowledge that he could bleed. The city moved on, as cities always do, but in its hidden corners the story of Amara Lewis lived on, retold with admiration, with wonder, with the kind of reverence reserved for legends born not from wealth but from courage. She was not famous, not celebrated in headlines, but among those who had seen her stand tall, she was unforgettable. And in the quiet of her new journey, as she boarded the plane to Germany, with her fellowship letter folded in her bag, Amara whispered the words that had carried her through every silence, every insult, every room where she had once been unseen. Speak, so that I may see you. The words were not just her father's anymore, they were her own. For in the end, the greatest legacy she left behind was not that she silenced a billionaire, but that she proved a truth timeless and unshakable. True wealth lies not in fortune, not in influence, but in the courage to stand with dignity, even when the world demands silence.